It is with immense pleasure that I introduce today's distinguished keynote speaker. Dr. Wendy Cukier is a professor of entrepreneurship and innovation at the Ted Rogers School of Management, founder and academic director of the Diversity Institute at Toronto Metropolitan University, and academic research director of the Future Skills Center, and former vice president of research and innovation at TMU. Wendy is an award-winning academic, best-selling author, and one of Canada's leading experts in disruptive technologies, innovation processes, and diversity and inclusion. Please welcome Dr. Cukier.
Thanks so much for that lovely introduction. So I'm really pleased to be here. I was delighted to have been invited to speak. And I should start by saying I'm joining from the traditional territory of the Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, and the Chippewa peoples. And many of you know that the university that I teach at, Toronto Metropolitan University, as part of its journey on truth and reconciliation, has changed its name. And at the Diversity Institute, we embed our commitments to truth and reconciliation in everything that we do. I also wanted to note that this is the second decade for people of African descent, and that's another perspective that is particularly important to us because, as many of you know, Canada's record on anti-Black racism is not necessarily well understood. We often think of ourselves as a safe haven, as the destination of the Underground Railroad, and overlook the fact that we had a history of slavery, segregation, and anti-Black racism. So those are just two things I wanted to note today. And I'll start by providing a little bit of context around who we are and our approach. As I said, as was said in the introduction, I lead research for the Future Skills Center, so we're really preoccupied with employment, but we also do work with entrepreneurs and on leadership, and all of these issues have implications for immigrants. We also are laser focused right now on the issues around backlash, and so I wanted to spend some time on that. The only thing that's worth noting about the Diversity Institute is we're fairly big. We have about 50 full-time staff. We have hubs across the country, but we're in the business school. And why that's important is because we have a commitment to human rights and social justice. We've led big initiatives, for example, around private sponsorship of, well, I was involved in resettlement of Indo-Chinese refugees before many of you were born. Syrian refugees, more recently, Afghan refugees. We do lots of on-the-ground work with immigrants, including those who come to Canada through the humanitarian streams. But we are really preoccupied with how doing a good job on equity, diversity, and inclusion drives organizational performance. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. So we know that Canada is in an age of disruption on multiple levels. We thought COVID was hard. What we're facing now is perhaps even worse. And it includes not just the uncertainty around trade, it includes the disruption and uncertainty around artificial intelligence. It includes the demographic shifts because, and full disclosure, I am not convinced that the current responses to public opinion around immigration were necessarily well thought out. I'll leave it at that. But the aging population is a reality in Canada as it is around the world. People like me are retiring or dying. I want to do the first before the second. But that means that all workforce growth will really come through immigration, whether the level is high, low, or in between. And I'll talk more about that. We continue to hear, despite rising unemployment, and we are facing significant unemployment, particularly in sectors. Those of you in Ottawa know there's going to be a massive layoff in the federal public service. And, one of the things we're working on is looking at strategies for addressing that and reskilling mid-career folks. But we still see that there are issues in terms of labor shortages, particularly with small, medium enterprises. We also know that the demographics of immigration have changed, and so the issues around race and immigration often are conflated. And for instance, if we look at the Black community in Canada, which is a growing segment of the population, 60% were born outside the country, and a lot of immigrants now are racialized. We also know that immigrants are better educated than the Canadian born population, and that there are differences between generations of immigrants in terms of their experience. And when we talk about the case for equity, diversity, and inclusion, while we tend to focus on the legislated categories under the Employment Equity Act, so women, racialized people, persons with disabilities, Indigenous peoples, and increasingly there's attention focused on the Black community as well as the 2S LGBTQ plus community. We also recognize that immigration is often a factor in all of those categories with the exception of Indigenous peoples. So when we look at the experience of women and we consider immigrant women, there's significant differences. When we consider racialized immigrant women, there are more differences. When we consider persons with disabilities, obviously there are particular experiences immigrants face that often result in trauma and mental health issues, and so on and so forth. So it is really important to recognize that when we talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion, while we're focused on the designated groups, we often consider immigrants as well. And when we think about the case for equity, diversity, and inclusion, as I mentioned, the talent pool is changing. I often say, don't talk to me about the dichotomy between excellence and merit and diversity. Because if you do not have diversity, if you do not have equity, if you do not have inclusion, you do not have excellence and you do not have merit because you're fishing in a very small pool. In the Greater Toronto Area, for example, the rate of immigration is higher than, say, in Ottawa, but more than half the population was born outside the country. And another 25%, like me, are the children of immigrants. So if you exclude first and second generation immigrants, you're dealing with 25% of the population. So, if you need talent and you don't consider immigrants who are better educated than everyone else, you're missing the boat, in my view. Similarly, we know that markets are changing, and some clever organizations go to the local grocery store these days, recognize that tastes and preferences and dollars are being spent on different things. We also know, and I'll talk more about this, that immigrants are more likely to be entrepreneurs. And in the current environment, Canada needs nothing more than it needs entrepreneurs. We're a country of small, medium enterprises. We're not a country of big businesses. 90% of private sector employment is with small, medium enterprises. Immigrants are more likely to create businesses, to create jobs, to drive innovation, and to export. And if that's not enough, we know that there are still very significant legal, reputational, and financial costs associated with discrimination. The other thing, I thought this was interesting because we did a big survey, 5,000 people with Environics. Immigrants are more likely to use AI than non-immigrants. And that's partly because they're better educated. It's partly because they're more likely to be in IT. But look at this, the difference between immigrant men and women is negligible when it comes to IT use, and it's significantly greater than among the general population. Why is this important? because we could talk a lot about AI disruption and skills. Everybody in business now is talking about needing AI skills. We also know that immigrants, when it comes to AI, Jeffrey Hinton and Yoshua Bengio are both immigrants. Hinton won the Nobel Prize for his work on AI, and we know that immigrants in general are overrepresented. Excuse me, in science, technology, engineering, math occupations, which everyone says we need. There's lots of research. I won't go into this in detail. If folks want my slides, I'm happy to share them. Lots and lots of details that you can use to make these arguments in terms of shifting consumer power, in terms of ways in which bias in product and service design can present barriers, and ways in which government policies and priorities can enable success among immigrant entrepreneurs. Despite the so-called backlash, we still see that most businesses recognize the value of diversity and inclusion. And in Canada, we do a lot of research on the role of immigrants in entrepreneurship. Look at this. Small, medium enterprises contribute 64% of private sector jobs, which is important. And 32% of business owners with paid staff are immigrants, which is a much bigger percentage than they are in the population. We also have a huge issue in Canada with succession planning, especially for family-owned businesses, small businesses, agriculture, and so on. If I were queen of the world, I would not have focused on the startup visas, although startups are important. I would have been laser focused on succession planning and bringing to Canada immigrants who had capital and experience and were able to take over businesses that otherwise are going to fold because the children of many family entrepreneurs, and this is especially true in farming, have left and don't want to do the same work as their parents. So there's lots and lots of research to reinforce that point, which is more important now than ever, that immigrants build businesses, they create jobs, and as we are looking for international markets, there is no better, our secret weapon is our immigrant population. And I know this firsthand. When I was the Vice President of Research and Innovation, I went on one of the, trade missions to China with the premier and the entourage and the, what are they called? The trade commissioners and so on. And I took one of my colleagues who was born in China, educated in China, and lots of connections in China. I got more meetings than the premier because my colleague knew everybody everywhere. I got driven around in a Jaguar for an afternoon. And when I went to meetings with him, he was able to interpret what was going on because I'd come out of the meetings and say, what happened? Did they like me? Did they hate me? Are we going to do a deal? Are we not going to do a deal? And he could interpret the cross-cultural communications. And that's something I think we have not adequately exploited. So there's lots and lots of evidence, again, that immigrants punch above their weight in terms of exporting, and they have great knowledge that we can take advantage of. There's also, and I'm not going to go on into detail on this, but we have lots of data to support this. Many of you work in the sector. You know these are facts, that there is unemployment and underemployment among immigrants, overqualification, lack of recognition of foreign credentials, there's discrimination, there's exclusion, and international entrepreneurs face barriers. I mean, someone can have millions of dollars and a great track record. They come to Canada, they can't get a credit card, they can't get a loan, et cetera, et cetera. Some of the banks recognize that this is stupid and are finding mechanisms around it. But there's no question that we have good evidence that despite their higher level of education, immigrants are more likely to be unemployed. And there's a lot of, last in, first out. We know that language can be a barrier, but here is a horrifying fact. Here's a horrifying fact. Scores on international language testing, like PIAC, do not predict employment. Do not predict employment. What that means is employers often say, oh, we don't hire immigrants because they don't have good English. But a lot of the immigrants score better on the PIAC scores than our native born university graduates. Language levels are not a predictor of employment. They are a predictor of longer term wages. But what that tells us is employers may use language as an excuse not to hire immigrants, but it simply isn't borne out by the reality. And we see lots and lots of evidence of that. We also see discrimination in hiring practice. We have lots. My colleague Rupa Banerjee and Jeffrey Wrights and Philip Oriopoulos did the study where they tested resumes. Applicants with foreign sounding last names are still less likely to be called back for interviews, particularly with small, medium enterprises. And of course, we are seeing rising political rhetoric. I never in my life expected to see some of the things that I have seen, immigrants eat cats and dogs and worse. So we have to be very attentive to misinformation and the impact that that's having. We see, for instance, that a third of immigrants report that they experience discrimination, and it's amplified if they're women, if they're racialized, if they're 2S LGBTQ plus. We see here, for example, that immigrant women report more discrimination than immigrant men or responses overall. And this is based on 40,000 respondents over 8 waves of the survey. This is not a little survey. This is a really big survey. And yet, our research on employers is really interesting. And this is a study Tony Fang did that showed that employers who hire immigrants hire more immigrants. Employers who hire immigrants are people who believe that immigrants are more hardworking than others, who believe that immigrants enhance workplace creativity, who do not believe that immigrants take jobs away from locals. And what this tells me is if we can get people in the door, if we can really prioritize things like work integrated learning and internships and so on for immigrants in the way that we do for youth, once people try them, they like them and they keep them. And so there's lots of evidence there. The other thing that I think is amazing is despite all the discrimination, despite the underemployment, despite the barriers, immigrants generally are more satisfied with how things are going in Canada compared to Canadians, and that includes immigrant men and immigrant women. So I want to spend my last few minutes talking about backlash and the media, because this is something that really keeps me up at night. The misinformation, the scapegoating, the xenophobia is horrifying. And I do not think people are creating a moral panic about this when they draw parallels to Nazi Germany. I will say that very overtly. I see things that really concern me. And if you don't agree, read the book called On Tyranny. We saw something I did not expect to see in my lifetime. We saw a massive shift in attitudes to immigration. From where we went from 2/3 of Canadians thinking that there was not too much immigration in Canada and only 27% thinking there was, to a situation where the majority of Canadians said that they agree there's too much immigration to Canada. And I would argue that this had a lot to do with the media. Yes, it had to do with changes in levels. Yes, it's true that we should have been more discerning, particularly with predatory programs targeting international students. And I think post-secondary institutions have to own the fact that they got greedy, et cetera, et cetera. I think there is no question we needed some recalibration. The point system was not necessarily aligned to employment. But remember, during COVID, there was no immigration, basically. And so part of what happened after 2020 was just a correction for that. What we saw, in my view, was backlash way beyond anything that was rational or evidence-based. And it's part of a bigger process, US courts backtracking and rolling back equity, diversity, and inclusion legislation. We saw lots of of claims around Canadian values starting to take hold. We saw at organizational level that some of the equity, diversity, and inclusion policies were superficial, not well implemented. And frankly, Canadians were suffering post-COVID. They were having a hard time. And when people have a hard time, they often look for others to blame. And scapegoating is a historical reality that we have seen over and over and over. And we really have to push back again. We've done research. I won't talk about it. You can look at it. One of the key narratives, and we can show this, was immigration and housing prices. The argument that immigrants were driving housing prices. I am not an economist, so I got an economist. And we did a paper that showed that immigrants accounted for at most 11% of the increase in housing prices. And this was confirmed by Stats Canada. And yet you had columnists in the Globe and Mail in particular and other media outlets writing column after column about the immigration system is broken. Poor Canadians can't afford housing. It's all because of the immigrants. The reality is the World Economic Forum, one of its top 5 solutions to the global housing crisis, and housing was a global crisis, was relax your immigrant policies. Why? Because immigrants build the houses. This was not a demand issue. This was also a supply issue. We did see lots of pushback, especially in the United States, but then we saw lots of corporations standing firm on their position. And when Shopify, Canadian company, threw its hat in the ring with the tech bros in the US, I don't need to name them, but one of them makes the Nazi mobile. 200 tech leaders in Canada signed a letter saying they stood behind EDIR. We saw votes more and more in large corporations withstanding the backlash despite the US context. And again, this was on equity, diversity, and inclusion more broadly, but I would argue that immigration factors into that. The other thing that for me was a real tragedy, and it was partly the political context at the time, was there was silence. There was a lack of leadership when you had all these people saying the immigration system's broken, there are too many immigrants, immigrants are eating cats and dogs. I believe our political leaders and our business leaders should have stood up and made a very clear argument about how immigrants build Canada. They didn't until after the levels were cut. And then the Chamber of Commerce stood up and said, What are you doing? This is a problem. We need immigrants. We saw small businesses saying, what are we going to do without foreign trade professionals? In Quebec, of all places, they launched a class action suit against the federal government. And so, I want to conclude before we go to questions and answers by just saying that we have to stop thinking that it's business as usual. We have to recognize this changed context. We also have to think not just about the messages, because I think everyone on this call probably agrees with at least half of what I'm saying about the value of immigrants, or you wouldn't be doing what you're doing. But we have to think about other people who don't think like us, who are not immigrants or the children of immigrants, who are immigrants but want to close the door after they've gone through, and try to figure out what is it that we need to say and do to shift public opinion. And, from my point of view, there's lots that we can think about. And it's um, I'll draw your attention to the quote on the right. It says, "I've learned that if you're hunting bear, you have to think like a bear. And I've learned to understand people's fears, their anger, in order to make it my friend." And that's really, from my point of view, one of the most important things to think about is how do we talk to people who don't agree with us? The good news is most Canadians still value equity, diversity, and inclusion. So, despite what we've seen in terms of the backlash against immigrants as a group, if asked the question, is EDI a good thing or a bad thing? Look at this. 50% of everybody, including white men, say that equity, diversity, and inclusion is a good thing. If we look at the percentage that say equity, diversity, and inclusion is a bad thing, look at those numbers. The people who say it's a good thing outweigh the number of people who say it's a bad thing by more than 2 to 1. 48% of white men say commitments to equity, diversity, and inclusion is a good thing, compared to 21% who say it's not. And that's where you get the most skepticism. So it's critically important, and not to let the discourse in the media and the crap that is spewing over the border from the US lead anyone to believe that Canada is still not deeply committed to equity, diversity, and inclusion. And while people may be concerned about immigration levels, we also have clear polling data that shows people recognize the value of immigrants. So, in terms of the way forward, we have to think about this broad discourse, policy, organizational practices. We have to recognize we have strong legislation. It has not changed. Regardless of the executive orders south of the border, Canada's legal and judicial framework still reinforces the importance of equity, diversity, and inclusion. When we think about organizational policies and practices, the evidence is really clear that equity, diversity, and inclusion drive organizational performance. And it's not just around human resources and representation and leadership. It's around product design. It's around procurement. It's around how we deal with customers and services. And I'm going to just jump through this because you can read and look at that. So from my perspective, sorry, this is the right slide. The other one was from a different presentation. From our perspective, it's critically important to recognize that immigrants build Canada. We have to mainstream gender and diversity across government policies. When we think about Build Canada, Buy Canada, major projects, we need to embed commitments to procurement for diverse entrepreneurs, as well as community benefits agreements. We need to use evidence, look at the market, look at the educated population, look at who the engineers are, look at who the tradespeople are. We need to think about pathways and start upstream. We need to make sure that immigrant kids succeed in school. We need to remember that within organizations, culture is critically important. Tone from the top, what we say, what we do. I was delighted to hear the words from the mayor, reinforcing how much he values immigration as part of the fabric of Ottawa. And we have to go beyond preaching to the choir. We have to really center, in my view, especially with this government, what employers want, what employers need, and really drive the case for immigrants. And from my point of view, there is no question. Immigrants helped build Canada. They built the railroads, they built the businesses, they built our hospitals, our schools, our universities. So, my message is simple. Immigrants are crucial to our economy. Canadians still support EDIR. We have to fight the backlash and address the barriers to immigrant economic inclusion. And we have to really work across organizations to achieve these goals. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Sukier, for a very insightful, very incisive, engaging presentation on the role of employer leadership in immigrants' economic inclusion. We have time for some questions, but I'm going to get the conversation started. I'm wondering, Dr. Sukier, if part of the problem is we're not actually having an honest conversation about what's happening in the country. And when I say not having an honest conversation, we're not having an honest conversation about what the fear is, where the backlash is actually coming from. The fact of the matter is, in the last 3 or 4 years, hundreds of thousands of migrants have come from the Ukraine, right? There have been about 300,000 Ukrainians who've come to this country since 2022. I'm not, so it's not so much that the Canadians are necessarily against quote unquote immigrants, right? But they're fearful of certain kinds of immigrants.
Absolutely.
Is this not just about race?
This
This
is
is about a fear of what the country is becoming, and this idea that the country is owned by a particular kind of person, and people are afraid that the country is slipping away from them.
I think again, going back to that slide, I think some Canadians, for sure, there's dog whistle politics that appeal to certain people. And I've said publicly, and I'll say it again, we would not have had blonde, blue-eyed Ukrainian asylum seekers sleeping on the streets in Toronto. My daughter came up from New York and was horrified during that period of time. And there's no question. I mean, I helped found Lifeline Syria, private sponsorship of Syrian refugees. Government pulled out the stops. One of the proudest moments I had as a Canadian, we brought 40,000 Syrian refugees into the country. I thought we could replicate that with Afghanistan. It has been brutal. It has been brutal. And I believe so honestly, Adrian, and I say this owning my white privilege, there is no question that racism is a problem and that there are different kinds of immigrants. There are the model immigrants and the less than model immigrants. And if you contrast the experience of the model immigrants and and their trajectory, it's very different than Black immigrants, et cetera, et cetera. So I own that completely. But what we see overall is for a long time, this was not an issue. Two-thirds of Canadians in like 2022, we still had a lot of racialized immigrants that were being welcomed to Canada. So I think that racism is part of it, but I really believe misinformation and scapegoating. And when you have one of the most powerful people in the world, one of the most powerful people in the world making claims like immigrants eat cats and dogs and immigrants are destroying our culture and immigrants are criminals, et cetera, et cetera. And you live in a country where we consume massive amounts of US media. And we live in a country where people are starting to experience hardship. So if someone comes up with a simple solution, which is immigrants caused this, in the same way in Nazi Germany, Jews and everyone else lived very happily in Europe for a very long time until you had demagogues saying, no, no, Jews are the cause of all of our problems, right? So I think we have to kind of separate out core beliefs and values, and I still have confidence in Canadians, from some of this misinformation that unfortunately took root on the one hand, and quite honestly, the lack of leadership. The lack of leadership. Because remember, we were going into an election. Everyone thought the Liberals would lose and someone else would win. And I believe business leaders, as a result, didn't want to say anything good about immigrants because, they didn't want to contradict the discourse that was coming out of the politics of the far right. And so I think it was a combination of stuff because if it were just about racism, you couldn't explain that rapid shift. Like, how did people's attitudes change almost overnight? I think it's more complex than that, but I would completely agree with you that I was embarrassed. And, my father was a refugee from Eastern Europe, but I was actually embarrassed by how easy it was and I'm an open doors person. I was happy to see Ukrainians come to Canada, but when I saw the contrast between how Ukrainians were being treated and Afghans were being treated, it was hard to draw any other conclusion than the one that you
Or even
cite.
the fact that the world's biggest humanitarian crisis right now is in the
Is
Sudan.
in Sudan. Yeah.
In the Sudan. We've seen, and you alluded to this in your presentation, we've seen really the obliteration of DEI programs, EDI programs in the United States across the board. It's been carnage, actually. An entire network has been erased in the last little while. How are we seeing that being manifested within organizations in Canada? What is your research telling you?
It's a really good question. I think we're lucky in Canada. We don't have executive orders that can obliterate the employment equity legislation. Remember, the employment equity legislation has survived governments of all brands. So when it comes to EDI, thankfully, I think we see some organizations that are modifying their language because they want to do work in the US and they want to do work in Canada. And I'm disappointed in the lack of leadership. I think we've seen organizations that previously had people waving flags and championing women and others, back off. I think we have seen progress. If you look at the Black North Initiative, organizations that signed up for that hit their 3.5%. If you look at the um, 30% Club, for the first time, we've seen the Ontario Securities Commission hit 30% women on boards, etc. So I don't think it's right to think, despite the rhetoric, that Canada is suddenly rolling back. But as someone said to me, when you start to see the pendulum shift, the first thing you see is stalling. It stops. The momentum stops. I think we have seen a loss of momentum after the murder of George Floyd, after the discovery of the unmarked graves in Kamloops, after the outpouring of support for Ukrainians and others. I think we've seen stalling. We've seen rollbacks in private sponsorship of refugees, etc. So there are indications that we better be very attentive, because my view is, if you look at what's going on with immigration, if you look at what's going on with transgender people and gender identity, it's slippery edge of the wedge. And I'm old enough to remember the first they came for the trained unionists, then they came for the Jews, then they came for me, and there was no one left. And that is what I fear. But I would say the evidence does not suggest that organizations are abandoning their EDI efforts. What it suggests is some are not speaking about them in the same way. Some are discontinuing bits of it. But, we had a meeting with a large bank yesterday, and they're asking us, how can we do better? How can we do better? And I think it's because foundationally, look at the demographics of Canada. Half the population's women, a quarter are immigrants, a quarter are racialized, 27% identify as having a disability. Add that together, and what have you got left if you aren't committed to equity, diversity, and inclusion? So I'm still optimistic, but we need leadership. We need business, in my view. We need more than the usual voices. And frankly, we need our political leaders to recognize that this is not a partisan issue. This is not political correctness. This is not wokeness, despite what the rhetoric says. This is about Canada's economic development. This is about our global success. This is about our global brand. And we have a great opportunity to attract the best and the brightest and to take advantage of, the mess, frankly, that's occurring south of the border.
I have one more question, but I should have. I acknowledged earlier the humanitarian crisis being faced by Sudanese, and I also should have mentioned the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, with tens of thousands of Palestinians who've been killed. We know in the last number of years. Um, I had another question. I'm wondering if part of the problem in this country is that we don't understand our history and we're not honest about our own history. And when I say that, one could make the argument that the biggest supporter of EDI in the last 50 years in this country was Preston Manning, was the Reform Party. Right? We're conservative forces in the West because the whole idea of the West wants in is essentially about EDI, right? It's about a section of the country feeling as if it's been historically excluded and marginalized and wanting a seat at the table and feeling that their skills, their knowledge, their resort that they are being taken advantage of, that they're not that their brilliance is not recognized, right? It's a kind of a cry when Preston Manning was saying the West wants in, it was a cry for recognition. It was a cry, and it was a desire to play a role in the society. But it was never framed. It was never framed as a call for EDI. I know that's going to sound controversial, but I'm curious as to what you think about that idea.
It's an interesting idea. I think it is. I would agree that it's a call for being included. I am not one of the people that thinks that diversity is everything. Like I'm a Sagittarius, you have a tattoo, we're diverse. I'm someone who kind of sticks to the designated groups and historic disadvantage as my definition of why we focus on these groups rather than those groups. So from that perspective, I wouldn't necessarily frame the regional or separatist sentiments in the West as equity, diversity, and inclusion. But I agree with you that the whole issue of Western alienation is something that should help people understand. I just am not sure that you can show that there were historically disadvantaged. That's where we might get into a dispute. But in the first part of your question, full disclosure, like I've worked in equity, diversity, and inclusion for a long time, and I learned stuff all the time. Like I didn't know. I knew about Chinese immigrants' role in building the railroad, and I knew about the head tax because I helped my daughter with her history. We never learned any of that stuff, none of that stuff. I only recently learned when we were working on a Black History Month project about the history of slavery, segregation, and all that stuff in my country. Like our history was, we're the destination for the Underground Railroad. We're the heroes. We're not the bad guys. It made me physically ill. I didn't know about the smallpox in the blankets, like there's a lot of stuff I really did not understand. And I think the important thing, particularly with people, for people with privilege, is to recognize you don't understand stuff and recognize it's a moving target, and we have to constantly refresh and change our views. But I do think history is important because if you don't understand history, you don't understand where employment equity came from, its rationale, and why it's critical to leveling the playing field.
Wendy, here's a question from Zainab Kuar, and I'm just kind of paraphrasing part of it, but she says, "Thank you, Dr. Sukier, for the insightful facts. Being a new immigrant from a few months now, I want to say that the backlash has made me reconsider my decision to leave the country. Aside from the technical skills, what are the specific skills expected by a Canadian employer towards a foreign worker?"
It's a really good question. And as I said, there's what they say and what they do. And the instinct is people hire people like them. So, men will gravitate more towards men, towards people who graduated from the same university, who play golf, etc. If you're racialized, you wear a hijab, uh, you may speak with an accent, etc., etc. You're different. And that creates disadvantages. So employers say they want skills, but the reality is a lot of them want to hire in their own image. So we have lots of work to do to ensure that employers, as I said, once they hire immigrants, they keep hiring immigrants, but we have to get folks in the door. I think one of the things that is most difficult for newcomers is a lot of the unspoken rules and the subtlety around culture. How much do you speak? How close do you get to people? How do you interact with others? How do you build social networks? Because in Canada, informal networks and who you know is more important than what you know. So going to events, getting to know people, learning how to use LinkedIn effectively. That doesn't mean you look up the president of the Royal Bank of Canada and send Dave Mackay your CV. There's a lot more nuance and subtlety to how you build those relationships. And I think that's what gets in the way for lots of people getting in the door for jobs.
Here's another question. What advice would you offer employers to ensure EDI efforts are substantive and systemic rather than symbolic or performative? In particular, how can organizations embed accountability, leadership commitment, and measurable outcomes into their EDI strategies?
My view is that the best EDI strategy is not an EDI strategy. The best EDI strategy is when you have EDI embedded in your corporate strategy. So the slides I didn't go through talked about that. So rather than thinking about EDI as something you bolt on, you have your corporate strategy, which is about serving customers or making money or, innovation or whatever your metrics are. And then you have an EDI strategy, which is around we trained a bunch of people and representation. If you can get the organization to think about their corporate strategy and think about how doing a good job on equity, diversity, and inclusion will help them serve diverse markets, will help them export, will help them attract and retain the best and the brightest. When we do an EDI strategy for any organization, whether it's Starbucks or, City of Mississauga, we start with the corporate strategy and say, what is it you're trying to accomplish? And then we ask the questions, how will equity, diversity, and inclusion help you serve your citizens better, help you sell more coffee, help you do whatever it is you're trying to do? And I believe whether we're talking healthcare, manufacturing, aerospace, critical minerals, educational institutions, every single sector, if you break down their corporate strategy, you can make the case for why equity, diversity, and inclusion is important.
Dr. Sukhia, you've noted that we're living in a very kind of fraught moment. And so given that, are there risks or consequences for businesses or nonprofits that are perhaps too vocal about their DEI or EDI commitments and actions?
I would say if you're trying to do business in the United States, yes, without question. I mean, I still, consider getting burner phones every time I go to see my daughter because the environment is so weird right now. So weird. So yeah, there are risks outside of the country. I feel quite honestly that within Canada, I showed you the data. Canadians, for the most part, are still with the program. I think the way in which you're framing what you're doing is really important. I mean, we worked with one organization, for instance, that asked us to come in and do a anti-Black racism, anti-oppression strategy. And in the middle of the project, the leadership changed dramatically. It was a elected, an organization affected by politics. And that language would not have worked. I am absolutely convinced they would not have got approval. We did not change one word of the strategy, but we relabeled it as equity, diversity, and inclusion. And some of that may be necessary depending on the environment that you're working in. Because if the goal is to produce the results, then you need to think about the language, you need to think about the messengers, and you need to think about your audience and who it is you need to support you. And the problem, I would say, and I own this as well, we're used to talking to each other, right? We can talk short form. We understand, when we talk about structural issues and systemic discrimination, we know what we're talking about. But if what we're trying to do is drive change more broadly, we have to think about how to translate that into language and actions that will motivate people who are not of the same mind necessarily, if that makes sense.
We're almost at the end of this section, but I do have another question. This one is from Joe Hamden. Joe says, as a DEI supporter, we've been providing the Intercultural Competence Program to newcomers, residents, job seekers, and employers. The question that I have, and I hope to get an answer, is what is the most effective investment Canada can make today to ensure immigrant talent is fully utilized within 5 years?
Such a good question. And I'm sure you know the stat, which is in Canada, after 5 years, immigrants earn 50% of Canadian born employees, whereas in Australia, it's 90. So we need to do a better job, in my view, of matching um, skills to employment opportunities, more focus on skilled trades rather than PhDs in English. So there's stuff we need to do with our criteria. But in terms of what is most effective, apologies if others have heard say this. I started my career in highway safety, and there's something in public health around injury prevention that talks about the 4 E's and how you drive change, whether it's smoking, cessation, or obesity, or highway safety. First E is education. It is the least effective way of driving change. It's necessary but insufficient. You tell me if I don't exercise, I eat too much, I'll get fat. Has no impact at all. You tell people don't speed. You show them, pictures of mourning families who lost family members to speeding. Very little impact on behavior. Add to that enforcement or legislation. Don't speed, there's photo radar, you're going to get caught. Maybe. I think legislation, regulation has an impact. Third level is economics. Follow the money. If the speeding offense has a $10,000 fine associated with it, I might think twice. But what is the most effective way of preventing speeding? The fourth E. So we have education, we have enforcement, we have economics, and we have engineering. The most effective way of stopping people from speeding is speed bumps. You speed, you kill your car. We need the equivalent of speed bumps. built into organizations so that this is not so much of a choice as a necessity. And that's where I think, you know, government regulation coupled with procurement, coupled with community benefits, coupled with expectations, leadership, all of those things that encourage organizations to build into their systems, to build into their strategies, equity, diversity, inclusion, cultural awareness, healthy workplaces, et cetera, et cetera. So we remove the choice. It's not choice. It's part of the fabric of your organization. It's part of the fabric of the country. That for me is the goal.
Well, Dr. Cukier, I think that's probably a good way to end this section. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your engagement. Thank you so much for your remarks throughout this period. We really do appreciate your fantastic presentation. Thank you for engaging us in a stimulating and important discussion that challenges organizations to double down on their efforts. You provided valuable insights and actionable strategies for us to implement in our workplaces. Dr. Wendy Cukier, thank you so much.
And thank you for the great discussion and questions. And I look forward to hearing from anyone who wants to pursue this